Hey guys, Josh with the Update Channel, and today what we're going to be talking about, folks, is a dinosaur. A huge, lumbering beast that used to roam the earth. What I'm talking about today is, folks, the Cat D399. You might be saying, Josh, I've never heard of this engine. Or maybe you have heard of it, but you've never seen one. I've actually been lucky enough to have seen, I think, 2 or 3 of them over my career, although it's been a long time since I've seen one. And I even got to work on them, not entirely by myself at the time. I was an apprentice at the time, but these were huge engines, folks. And what we're going to be talking about is the specifications on them, what they were in, why you don't see them anymore, and what was interesting about them. So first off, why did I even bring up this topic with this engine that seemingly is extinct? Well, first off, like I said, I've already seen them in person, but someone actually sent me a Destruction of the Week of one, and I thought, you know what, that would be an interesting video to do on the D399. So let's first off discuss what the heck is this engine, and then I'll show you the Destruction of the Week. I'll do a couple stories about it. But first, I want to say a special thank you to Jeff M., who, unlike me, has experience on these engines, used to work on them back in the heyday. He's a subscriber. Hopefully he watches this video. But he gave me a lot of information because, folks, I am nowhere near an expert on this engine at all. I do know they're yellow and they're big, and a lot of other information. A lot of it I got from Jeff, but let's get into what is interesting about these engines. So as a quick overview of the D399, it was a V16 4-cycle diesel engine. It was made in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And it was humongous. It was 17,000 pounds dry. You might be saying, well, dry and wet, what's the weight difference there? Well, it held 160 gallons of engine oil and about 100 gallons of coolant. A little bit less than that, but once you add on the radiator, it'd be more than that. They weren't in any machines either. This was not a production engine that went in equipment, so that's probably why a lot of you haven't seen them. Or also not in any on-highway trucks. As I already said, it's a huge engine. It's 10 feet long, 17,000 pounds dry, folks. So you're talking probably close to 20,000 pounds once you add on all the accessories and fluids and everything else. The yellow paint, that weighs a lot. So this was an enormous engine, and really only in a few applications, of course, with it being so large. Mostly, and the way I knew about them was generators, and they made them for a long time for generators. Very interesting in that most generators, large generators, run at about 1,800 RPM. Most of these seem to run around 1,200. It seems like 1,200 was the real sweet spot for these, which is really low RPM. I mean, a high idle is 1,000 RPM usually, so you're not even at a very high RPM. These were not fast spinning engines, and there are a variety of reasons for that, which we'll talk about in Jeff's letter that really highlights more information on them. But it was a very long stroke, small bore engine. So couldn't really rev that fast, folks. And they didn't make a ton of power. I mean, their power to weight ratio is about 13.5 pounds per horsepower. A 3406E basically at 550 horsepower is about 5 pounds per horsepower. So not a very efficient for power to weight ratio there. But let's get into Jeff's letter. He's got some interesting stories, and I'll kind of throw in some of my own anecdotes about this, and then we'll get the Destruction of the Week pictures that someone sent in on it. But all right, so here's what Jeff wrote. The Cat D399 engine was the 3rd generation of engines that were not designed to power Caterpillar equipment, which I already mentioned. This was not in a bulldozer. It was not in a wheel load or anything like this. This was a stationary only application. So it was the king of the Caterpillar engine offerings for over 2 decades, those being the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. It saw use in many applications and had many adaptations. It saw wide use in the oil fields, marine propulsion, marine auxiliary, narrow gauge railroad, power generation, both prime and standby, and industrial power unit applications. It was a 16-cylinder V4-cycle diesel engine. It also offered in a gas-fired version known as the G399. I did not know that. That's very interesting. Let's see, it had a cylinder bore of 6 1/4 and a stroke of 8 1/2. Now, looking at a spec sheet for these engines, it actually shows that it had a bore of 6 1/4 and a stroke of 8. So unless there were different versions, his bore was off here a little bit, but Yeah, it was a very long stroke, small bore engine, relatively speaking. I mean, a 3406E, for example, is a 5.4-inch bore and a 6.4-inch stroke. So this had significantly more stroke than bore, making what is referred to as an over square engine. Now, that's actually inaccurate. It would be an under square engine. And over square would be a large bore, small stroke engine, like a gas race car engine or something. But capable of great torque, definitely. A long stroke diesel engine, of course, makes a ton of torque, especially if it's making 1,250 horsepower at 1,200 RPM, folks. Most gas engines, of course, make horsepower by revving up very high. This is very low RPM, and to still make 1,250 horsepower, you have to be making a lot of torque. All versions were dual turbocharged with an aftercooler. Standard was water jacket aftercooling, and separate circuit aftercooling was offered, with the seawater aftercooling being offered when in the marine environment. The fuel system had a fuel pump with separate cam-operated pumps in the valley of the cylinder block and delivered the fuel to capsule nozzles in the pre-combustion chambers in the cylinder head via individual high-pressure fuel lines. Now, this is my first little anecdote. So one of the couple jobs I had, and this was back at Cashman Cat in Nevada, they had old power modules, which is basically a truck trailer with a generator on it. And there were a couple of these 399s still running around there. And one of the jobs I remember was and I was an apprentice at the time, but there was an older mechanic there, and he had to get the fuel pump out of this power module. And these fuel pumps, folks, are huge. It's a 16 cylinder. So this big mechanical fuel pump, which sat in the valley of the V on this engine, had to be craned out. The engine fuel pump had to be craned out through the roof. So he actually had to cut a hole in the top of this truck trailer that this unit was in, and they had to crane out the fuel pump. And I don't know what they did for a replacement fuel pump, because these were very old and obsolete. I don't want to say obsolete. They were very old model engines back when I was working on it in the early 2000s. So I'm not sure what they did with that fuel pump, if they just had it rebuilt at the fuel pump place in Nevada, or if they were still able to get a reman. I'm not sure, but I just remember thinking, I'm glad I'm not the only one working on this, because I was super uncomfortable working on that engine. The other thing was the fuel lines. This was a 10-foot long engine, folks. So remember, the fuel lines have to run from that valley all the way to every corner of that engine to get fuel to the nozzle injectors. So I should just say fuel nozzles. So they were super long and complicated routings, because generally you want fuel lines to be the same length, or it can cause discrepancies in the fuel flow rates. So you'd have a fuel line that had to be 8 feet long, but it was only a foot away from the nozzle that it was running to. So that was it was weird. But yeah, such a interesting engine. So let's get back to Jeff's letter here. So full engine power could be taken from either end of the engine, which that's interesting. So you could run off the front damper or the rear. Engine rotation could also be changed, but was very labor intensive, as the crankshaft and camshafts had to be flipped over. That sounds super complicated. The front gear drive had to be reoriented, not requiring any additional major parts. Common in marine applications, with two engines to be of opposite rotations, which I've never worked in marine applications, so that's interesting to know. There was an adapter group that would allow two engines to be coupled together, flywheel to damper. That would be weird to have them. You'd have basically a 32-cylinder engine there. Cat had a prototype marine gear that had input from two D399s with a single shaft output. Lufkin had a marine gear that had the input from two D399s that we used in FV American number 1. I don't know what that's referring to. Let's see. The engines were removed and replaced by the Cat 3516s in the 90s. So yeah, mostly when I was working on generators in the 2000s, it was all 3500s, either 3508s, 3512s, or 3516s in these power modules and backup generators. So that's why we didn't see many of these 399s. Cat basically made their own engine obsolete by the 3500 series of engine, which were they made a lot more power in a similarly sized package, a lot more modern design. They weren't running external fuel lines. They didn't have a main fuel pump. The later ones were electronic unit injectors, so much different engine It also seemed to be easier to work on also. They had more side cover plates. They had individual cylinder heads. These had two cylinder heads, so it wasn't one big cylinder head. It was two cylinders basically would be covered by one cylinder head on the D399. Jeff says, I saw an oil platform generator setup where two D399s powered a generator with a generator in between them. That is unusual. I wonder if it was flywheel to generator and then flywheel to other end of the generator. That would be a super long, weird application, but I guess it would work. So before we discuss the aspects of the D399 anymore, how about a little destruction of the week? And this week's destruction of the week comes from Chris, and this was in a hospital emergency backup generator room apparently. And yeah, you can see there are some parts that does not look like they were supposed to be on the floor there. We've got something coming out of the block here. This is a 399. And yeah, apparently firemen called and said there was smoke coming out of the generator room. And we have this disaster. As you can see, this engine was in really good shape. It's probably really low hours as a backup generator, but this one, not looking too good. There is something in there real closely right there. Missed the screaming sheep. And yeah, pretty much destroyed this block, unfortunately. Looked like a really low hour clean machine up to this point. Not sure what they ended up doing with it. Thank you to Chris for sending it. And let's get back to the discussion here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the design of the 399, and then we'll talk about some shortcomings with it, and that'll be the video. So let's get back to Jeff's information here. The engine oil and fuel filters are of the cartridge type, meaning they went into a housing instead of being spin-on the front of the engine. Very similar to 3500 series. Standard were simplex consisting of a single set of filter. An optional duplex system was offered, which provided the ability to change filters with the engine running. These were primarily used on marine propulsion engines. Standard air cleaners were of panel type. Extreme service air filters were optional, as were dust injectors. I have never heard of that before. Must have been a way to bypass the filters to a different filter set that changed them out while it was running. Folks, I don't generally, even though I've been around a lot of them, I'm not super comfortable even being really next to running engines, let alone this 17,000 pound 16-cylinder beast. I would be really nervous of changing filters on a running engine, probably especially in a marine application where very tight quarters. And you've got hot oil, hot fuel, hot parts, filters coming in and out. But that is good to know, though. I mean, you could keep the engine running and still service it. That's interesting. Lube oil was provided by a gear-driven oil pump. Came with a pre-lubrication pump, and these were supplied in 4 versions. There was a 24-volt version, an air version, and a 5 or 3 gallon per minute 240-volt AC version. Constant running for standby applications for emergency power when startup was within 5 seconds. That's pretty cool. Most of the 3500s didn't even have it. They have a pre-lubrication system. Makes a lot of sense if you're going to be going under load very quickly to pre-lube the engine. Standard starting was a pair of 24-volt DC 50 MT starters mounted on each side of the flywheel housing. These operated in parallel. Optional was an air start, usually coupled with an air-driven pre-lube pump. A hydraulic starting system was available, but seldom used. How would a hydraulic starter? I've never even heard of that. You'd have to have an electric pump, I'm guessing. An electric pump to power a hydraulic pump to power the starter. Unless you already have something that has another running engine with a hydraulic pump. I don't know why you'd have a hydraulic starter. I've never even heard of that before. The starter would not activate until the pre-lube reached minimum oil pressure. This was accomplished by a normally open pressure switch. When the contacts closed, the starters would engage. So remember, folks, this engine came out in the 60s, and diesel technology at the time wasn't as, I don't want to say amazing as it is now, but you got to figure emissions were not really a problem. Fuel burn rates, power to weight ratios not as Not as modern as we are used to here, folks. This was a turbocharged engine, but of course it was a pre-combustion chamber. It had a big mechanical fuel system. You know, I already mentioned the power to weight ratio was not that great, but you know, it powered engines and it would run for a long time. So let's get to his weak points of the engine. So the biggest factor in engine life was the cylinder liner block design. The cylinder liners were flanges that fit into a counterbore in the deck of the cylinder block. When wear occurred at this point, there were 3 procedures to restore correct liner protrusion to get the crush on the head gasket. First was to cut the counterbore deeper and shim the liner back to spec, just like on the 3400 series. Second was to cut the counterbore deeper and install what was referred to as an L sleeve. And the last one is to cut the counterbore completely out and install a Z sleeve. This last step was very machining intensive and usually required the block to be stripped down bare and sent to an outside machine shop. At this required machining of the water directors. Steps 2 and 3 were also used when cracking the counterbores were detected. While still available, new blocks were sold and used, as this was usually less costly than buying a replacement engine. The high-pressure fuel lines were problematic, as engine vibration would cause the sealing ferrules to wear out and leak, or if the fuel line dampers were worn and missing, it would cause wear on the outside of the fuel lines. Fuel consumption was high for the output of these engines being developed in a time when fuel was cheap and emissions were of little concern. So yeah, folks, these engines are still out there, as you can see from the destruction of the week. Standby generators, prime generators, marine applications. I don't know how many. I couldn't find how many of these engines they produced. Obviously, they had a wide variety of applications, but with them being so big, it's not one you would see every day unless you were in marine or railroad or any of that stuff. And their power to weight ratio over time hasn't been that great. I mean, you can get a C18 that'll make comparable power to this and only weigh 3,000 pounds instead of 17,000 pounds. Not sure if it would last quite as long, but very interesting engine. We're talking old cat iron here, folks. Now, if you have a story, I'm sure some of you do, about the 399, leave it in the comment section. I pretty much read almost all the comments, so I'll find it interesting. Probably most of the other people watching this video find it interesting also. And as always, thanks for watching.